So as I'm sure you can see, this is not a battle replay. This is in fact the test build for 0.95, which is of course the ever elusive new patch, which, as you'll find out, is very nearly upon us, I think. I'm not sure quite how long it will be, but just the fact that it's in a mostly working condition with a lot of changes would lead me to believe that it is going to be upon us quite soon. So this is kind of a quick and dirty video where I'm just going to be showing off all of the new units. There are some units from the last patch which have been removed. You know, the Morannon units for Mordor come immediately to mind. So yeah, I mean, I won't be going through all of the ones that have been removed. Obviously, I'll be going more into that, into the faction overviews, and I won't be going into the stats of the units here either, because they might have a few minor changes before the final release, and I would rather be doing that within the faction overviews of each faction, because it's more relevant there. Here we'll just be having a look at the new units, and I'll be going through what they are kind of intended to be used for, in my opinion. Of course, I could be wrong about that, but yeah, we'll start off with the first of the new units on the list. So when it comes to Gondor, they actually only have one new unit, and it isn't exactly anything too special, because it is these guys and girls which are civilians, and they aren't unique to Gondor either. A couple of the other human factions have them. I know that Rohan do off the top of my head, and I think a couple of others as well. Obviously these aren't going to set the world on fire with how good they are, but they are a new unit for Gondor, and they do fulfill a sort of more cannon fodder role, which has been sort of lacking in the human factions, mainly because the militia units do fulfill that role, but they are also more expensive than the equivalent orcs. So it's kind of an interesting situation here. Gondor, the majority of the changes when it comes to Gondor will be with regards to the mechanics of the game as a whole. So Gondor will really benefit from a lot of the changes that have been made to how infantry, archers and cavalry work, and that will hopefully make Gondor more competitive. But this is kind of a funny new unit which has been added, so this is all that there is for Gondor. But we'll move on to some of the more units which I think most people will find a little bit more interesting than the cannon fodder. Now Rohan do have a few new units, and this one is the cheapest of the new units, but it also might be the new significant with how much it helps Rohan, because this is the Erebor Infantry, and it is essentially a sword and shield variant of the dismounted Royal Guard, and there have been a lot of name changes with Rohan, and the dismounted Royal Guard are now called the Erebor Spearmen. But this is an interesting unit simply because it gives Rohan a genuine sort of mainline sword and board unit, which is something they have always lacked ever since vanilla. So this could make Rohan's infantry line genuinely able to at least go toe-to-toe with a lot of the other infantry lines in the game, and then allow their cavalry to be the thing that does the damage. So I will be interested to see how these guys perform and how they change Rohan, particularly how they go up against factions in siege battles, where these guys will do a particularly good job, I think, of padding out Rohan's infantry line and make it so they don't fall apart quite so easily. But Rohan do have two higher tier units that have also been added, so let's go and take a look at them. So, as far as this unit goes, they are a Javelin unit, the Meduseld Guard, and of course, based on their armour alone, you can tell that they are an elite unit because they share the same armour as the dreaded Calanardon Knights, although they have also been renamed to the Sons of Yore. So Rohan have got a lot of renaming and a lot of redoing of a lot of how their units look, I believe, as well. But the Meduseld Guard are an all-new unit, and of course, they are a kind of Javelin elite infantry hybrid. As far as like the numbers in the unit goes, they are slightly lower on the spectrum, so they won't be able to go toe-to-toe with a lot of the elite units all on their own. But they do add quite an interesting dynamic, because these guys combined with a lot of shield maidens means Rohan is going to have a lot of close range punch with regards to their infantry. And I think that in particular, once again, this is a unit that is really going to benefit Rohan in a siege battle, both offensive and defensive. In an open field, this unit may well be focused down a little bit more because they are potentially very dangerous, I think, based on the relative stats compared to a lot of other units. But even so, it's a nice addition to Rohan. It's nice to see them get another high-tier foot unit. But the other unit that they have been given is a new horseback unit, which is more in fitting with how Rohan go about their warfare. So let's go and take a look at that one. And so here we have the addition to Rohan's cavalry force, and it could be quite significant because horse archers will be generally buffed, I think. I think they will be made a lot more attractive to use on the battlefield, and this is something that Rohan in particular may be able to use to their advantage. The Red Shields, however, are not just a horse archer, they are a hybrid Horse Archer, and Melee Cav. Now, I'll go into a little bit more about how Melee Cav is intended to work when the patch actually arrives, I think, because it will be quite a significant change to how it's the Destroyer of Worlds and the King of the Battlefield right now, because it will still be able to do quite a lot of damage, but you'll have to be more careful with it. The fact that these red shields are not only ranged cav but also melee cav means they're going to be ideal for engaging other cavalry forces. They're going to be able to weaken them from range with their bows, and then they're going to be able to engage them in melee with their swords. Now, melee cavalry in general tends to be a little bit slower, so they won't be able to do the hit and run tactics that some of the other skirmish cav will be able to do, but they are a lot more solid, and they can form a very nasty centre to your cav if you want to go that route. If you want to go for a little bit more of the ranged poking from a distance cav, as opposed to the sort of bulldozers that you can use in the shape of the Sons of Yore and some of Rohan's other heavy hitting cavalry. But yeah, I'm interested to see how the Horse Archers will perform in terms of the meta going forward, because if they perform well, the red shields could well prove to be one of the most difficult units to deal with in an open field, which would give Rohan a really nice tool to use in that situation. And of course they have the same unit model as the Marshals of the Red, only they have their shields on their arms. So I was always a fan of the Marshals of the Red, so I'm glad to see their unit models and colour scheme getting a bit more love. But yeah, those are the 3 new Rohan units, and we shall now move on to another faction's new units. So, for the Dwarves of Erebor, we have the Grim Guard, which are one of the hyper-tier units that the Dwarves have available to them. And this is a unit which I believe is meant to offset the fact that the Mithril Guard have been moved to the second of the Dwarven factions, of course, because Khazad-dûm have been added. So this is sort of the replacement for them, and as you can see they are a little bit more offensive focused, it seems, because they are dual wielding weaponry. They have quite ostentatious looking armour, as befits Erebor's massive treasury. And yeah, this is obviously, you know what to expect from a really high tier attack focused Dwarven unit, because you've seen the Sons of Durin in action before. They will do a ton of damage over a long period of time. They're going to be very difficult to wear down, but ultimately they do have fewer unit models, so you do need to help them out. But you know, the Dwarves of Erebor have access to all of the Ironfoot units, so they're going to be able to support them with a decent mainline as it is. They don't have shields, so potentially they could be focused down from afar, but Dwarven armour will usually mean that they can stand up to that, and in particular in the new patch where archers will not be able to shred through armour quite so easily, these guys are going to be able to wade through low tier archer fire like it wasn't even there. So yeah, I mean, this is really just going to be a powerhouse of a unit, especially in a real blob fight where they're going to be able to get a ton of kills. Particularly, well, I think that most Dwarven units with these axes again, so you know how the Dwarves be, I guess, and the Grim Guard is also quite a cool name. So we'll see how the 2 Dwarven factions perform against one another when the new patch comes out, but I would be interested to see how these guys match up to the other high tier Dwarven units when all of the stats are finalised. So you may be thinking what this unit is doing in the Dwarven roster, and this is because this is a sort of mercenary unit which several factions do have. It's just that on the list the Dwarves were the first ones I noticed which actually had them, and they are the Merchant's Crossbowmen. They are mounted crossbows, and I'm sure some people are absolutely horrified to see that crossbows have been given mounts, but you know, the way that crossbows ultimately work has been changed, mainly for the fact that they have very limited ammunition, and these guys are no different. But these guys are intended, I think, to be cavalry hunters in particular, where they will be able to kite cavalry around, particularly heavy cavalry, like really fast shot cavalry I think will be able to catch these guys. But slower, sort of heavier cavalry is going to be very vulnerable to these guys, and it gives the Dwarves in particular an option which they wouldn't otherwise have, because obviously the Dwarves traditionally are quite a slow, static faction, and in an open field this can be used against them quite heavily, particularly more recently with the dominance of cavalry and long-ranged armor-piercing archers. So this is an interesting addition to the game as a whole, not just for the Dwarves. It will be interesting to see how strong they actually are when they are used on the field, and I would be interested to see how effective they can be at zoning out cavalry in the hands of a player with good micro. But yeah, so this is a unit which several factions have. Like, I know that Umbar have them, a couple of others as well. I think Eriador, well, Cardolan I should say, have them as well. But yeah, this is the only other new addition to Erebor. Most of the new stuff with the Dwarves comes with how they've been divided up. So some of the units have gone to Khazad-dûm, a lot of them have stayed with Erebor. Most of the new Dwarven units, though, are in Khazad-dûm, of course, which we will get onto a little bit later. Of all the factions that existed in the game previously, I think Cardolan, previously known as Eriador, have probably undergone the biggest visual change, because they look really, really awesome now. This is an all-new unit as well, one that I think they share in common with Rhudaur, if I'm not mistaken. These are the sellswords, which are kind of just a basic shock infantry unit. I believe that's how they're intended to be used. They're a swordsman, so, you know, as Erebor, well, it's going to take me a while to get used to calling them Cardolan, but as Cardolan, you're not going to be restricted to just using lumbermen as your sort of basic shock units anymore. You can use these guys as well, particularly if you think you're going to be coming up against a faction which isn't quite so reliant on their armour. You know, it's going to be a lot more worth your time bringing these guys. And it gives, you know, and also, like, most of the time, like, Battle Ready Dunedain, which are now a Cardolan exclusive, are a little bit more expensive, obviously. So if you want to go for a little bit more of an affordable option, you have these guys as well. And I like the look of them as well, like chainmail, some neat looking helms as well. Cardolan in general just look a lot nicer now. So yeah, that's this unit, and again, I think they share it in common with Rhudaur. So now we'll move on to another one of Cardolan's new units, because they do have several. Now, I wasn't sure whether to include these guys on a new unit list, but I think they have changed significantly enough that I can, because it wasn't just a case of them getting a new paint job with some of the others. The Cardolan footmen have essentially changed from a throwaway unit that you send into cavalry and armour into an elite tier unit for largely the same purposes. Like, you're going to be using these guys obviously with their large pole axes, well, halberds I guess, or war hammers, because they are kind of blunt. You're obviously going to be sending them into sort of the thick of the fighting, and they're going to be doing a lot of damage. So they are now an elite tier unit. This is kind of just a sort of quick mention for these guys, because they technically existed in the game before, but I do think they've changed enough that they do deserve a mention on this new unit list. So yeah, the Cardolan footmen, very much an elite unit now. So you know me, I'm a big fan of my pikemen usually, and Cardolan now have a very elite pike unit in the shape of the Barrow Downs Protectors, and, you know, you can tell from the visual style that the obvious cues were taken from the Arnor Gate Guards of the last patch, so they're going to be one of the more elite pike units that you can procure in the game now, I believe. And yeah, I mean, they look pretty fantastic. They are quite expensive for pikes, obviously, so, you know, they're going to be much more useful in sieges, I would say. Otherwise, they are going to be quite vulnerable on a map like Grassy Plain, for example, to being focused down. But even so, they look fantastic. And they also give Cardolan a really neat option in a defensive siege, I think. You know, whereas before they had to make do with the Cardolan footmen, which... not the Cardolan footmen, the Cardolan Protectors, or whatever they were called, the cheap pikes that they had. They were sort of, you know, a decent, cheaper pike unit in terms of the game, but ultimately cheap pikes did have their downsides, whereas these Barrow Downs Protectors should be able to get around some of that, so they should be able to hold their ground a little bit more easily, and they should be able to get some more killing done. So yeah, they look great, and obviously they've got the visual cues taken from their cousins across the border in Arthedain. So that's, I believe, all of what we can expect from in terms of new units from Cardolan's infantry. We'll now move on to some of their new ranged contingent. And firstly, we have these guys, who are the Cardolan heavy sharpshooters, who are crossbows, and I'm sure that some people are thinking, well, Cardolan didn't really need another crossbow unit because of the gatekeepers, but however, the gatekeepers were always a hybrid unit between crossbows and pikes, sort of an anti-cav option, sort of a hard counter to heavy cavalry, one of the few that existed in the last patch. Whereas the Cardolan heavy sharpshooters are just straight up crossbows. You know, they shoot from against heavily armoured units and will do a lot of damage. They don't have a lot of ammo, however, and, you know, that's pretty much all there is to say about the Cardolan heavy sharpshooters. I would put them in the same sort of category as Uruk-hai crossbows and that sort of unit. You know, they obviously have a little bit more armour than something like the clan crossbows of Rune, but they're not going to be quite as good as the Cardolan gatekeepers, which still do exist, of course. They've been given a visual overhaul as well to be sort of more heavily armoured looking, and they still have their large billhooks as well, I believe. So yeah, here are the Cardolan heavy sharpshooters. If you just wanted a straight up sort of cheaper variant of the gatekeepers, as it were, just to give you some armour piercing range power, you will now have that option as Cardolan. But they aren't the only new ranged unit that Cardolan have, as we will now look at. And the final unit we will be looking at that is all new for Cardolan are the Cardolan Bodyguards, obviously intended to house the general, and they are essentially an archer elite infantry hybrid. They'll pull out their spears and shields in melee, but of course they are also a very effective long-range unit. You know what to expect largely from sort of elite archer units. They're going to be very effective at range. Obviously they do have a low unit count, so, you know, they are the sort of unit which, if it comes down to sort of a few units at the end, If these guys are still at full strength, having shot all their ammunition, they could well win you the battle, but obviously you don't want to rely too heavily on them in melee because there aren't very many of them. They look fantastic though. I have to say Cardolan's new look is very, very appealing. It makes Cardolan a lot more appealing to play, because one of Erebor's problems in the past has always been, in my opinion, that they've looked a little bit plain. Now though, you know, a lot of the sort of new unit models for Erebor, Cardolan look really, really awesome as well. Like pretty much every unit, aside from the like very lowest tier units like the Lumbermen, have been given a new look, and the Battle Ready Dunedain have sort of kept their old look as well. But yeah, I'm excited to see Cardolan in action in the next patch, because I think they will finally get a lot more of the respect that they deserve. But now we shall move on to the next faction in the running. So the Elves of Lothlorien have been given a couple of new units, and the first of which kind of reinforces the point that Lothlorien are meant to be the sort of the faction of elves that has a really solid mid-tier sort of infantry and archer core, I think, because the Galathrim swords are new, and I believe they are intended to be sort of the Lothlorien elves version of the Imladris Storm Guard that Imladris have, of course, and you know, this is going to be an interesting sort of dynamic between them and the Sylvan Axemen, because it's going to mean that they have AP and a good light armor killing machine as well. So it's going to make the Elves of Lothlorien particularly difficult to break down in terms of just trying to fight them one-to-one. I think that the Elves, your best bet is going to be to use mass again, because Elves are going to be a little bit more susceptible to that. But we'll see. We'll see how these guys perform, because it will be interesting to see how you balance your army as Lothlorien between the AP and the non-AP variant but higher base damage. So again, it's going to be a choice that you make between these guys, and also the Sylvan Heavy Spearmen will come into that as well, because then you have spears, which I think in the new patch the intent is for them to be a lot more useful against cavalry in particular. So it's going to be an interesting balancing act with your main line as Lothlorien. But it isn't just a mainline unit that Lothlorien have been given, they've also been given an elite melee unit, which we'll have a look at now. The other unit that the Elves of Lothlorien have been given are the Caras Caladhon's Guardians. I hope I've said that right, but they are essentially a very elite pike unit. Again, they do have the very long spears trait, so I think that, again, the unit that you can look for from the last patch, which is going to be quite similar, are going to be the Imladris Guards, of course. Very elite elven pikes. They're going to get their killing done faster than the elite equivalent of human pikes, but of course they do have less in terms of armor, usually less in terms of unit count as well. And also they can probably be pushed through slightly more easily, because the elves in general are going to be more susceptible to that, but they can potentially do very high amounts of damage, I imagine, simply because that is what the Imladris Guards could always do. And the fact that Lothlorien have been given a similar unit is interesting, because in a field battle they're not going to be able to protect them too easily from just being skirmished down. However, in a siege, these guys are going to be potentially very, very useful, whether they're going to be the final wave on the attacking side or the final stand on the defensive side. I think these guys could potentially win you the match in both cases. So yeah, it's going to be interesting to see how these guys perform in general. I think the stats on these guys are not done entirely, because they still have their old very high stats. So this is one of the reasons why I'm not showing the stats of units at the moment, because these guys have not yet been fully finished. But even so, they look great, and they will add another option for Lothlorien's roster, because pikes was always something that they really lacked. So yeah, now we'll move on to the next faction. So now we move on to the Orcs and Mordor, and the first of their units is a kind of interesting looking one, because it's the Troll Drummers, and morale is something which they've called a little bit more attention to in the sort of UI when you're picking your armies in this patch. So I would imagine that morale is going to be a little bit more important going forwards, and obviously this means that your Orcs are going to be a little bit more susceptible to breaking, I would imagine. The Troll Drummers remove the chance of this happening, because they will keep Orcs that are fighting around them in the fight. They are also trolls, of course, and as far as combat stats go, I think they're going to be sort of similar to the Troll Catapult, where they're not really going to last too long in melee, but they're still not exactly the sort of unit you're going to want to send in trash fodder units against, because they will just get squashed. Elite units will be able to take down the Troll Drummers pretty quickly, though, I would imagine. Even so, it's an interesting concept. I'll be interested to see how this actually works, and whether it is genuinely useful for Mordor or not. Because if there are breaking issues with Mordor's front line, particularly their lower tier troops against some of the new units, the Troll Drummers might be a necessary part of Mordor's army in some cases. But we'll see. We'll see how this unit pans out. But it's an interesting idea. The Shield Maidens had this sort of encourage ability in the past as well, but it was never really something which was too much attention was drawn to. We'll see if this unit is any different. But now we'll move on to some of the other new stuff that Mordor has available to them to make up for the fact that the Morannon units are no longer available to them in a direct sense anyway. So Mordor have got one new unit in terms of sort of melee infantry, and it is these guys, the Black Legion of Barad-dûr, and I believe the idea behind them is to be a sort of diet version of the Blackwatch Legion. So again, big shields, more mass than average. Their primary purpose is going to be either defending and holding a line or pushing through a line. Now again, they're not going to be quite as good as this as you've seen in the past as the Blackwatch Legion, but they will still give Mordor a much more solid option to their frontline infantry than just standard Uruk-s. So it is an interesting replacement to the Morannon Uruk-s, because these guys ultimately are more elite than the Morannon Uruk-s were, at least in relative terms. The stats have been crunched across the board. But yeah, I'll be interested to see how these guys perform as well. Again, I would imagine they're going to fulfill the same sort of role as the Blackwatch Legion did for the Orcs of the Misty Mountains, which will be interesting to see how that plays out for Mordor with some of their really nasty higher tier stuff. But yeah, in terms of melee infantry, this is the new thing to see from Mordor. I like the fact that we've got another big shielded unit, because of course pushing through with brute force is something that you can imagine the Orcs doing, and if these guys are at the front, allowing the hordes to pour through the gaps in the line, that's going to be quite a potent strategy to use if these guys are good at their job. So yeah, now we shall move on to, I think Mordor have got one more new unit. So finally for Mordor, we have the Orc Javelins. Essentially, Mordor never had Snaga Javelins, so they've been given these guys instead. Low tier Javelins, again, very self-explanatory. In the past, low tier Javelins have always been quite an easy way to earn back your money. In particular, the Rivermen and the Snaga Javelins in the last patch were a very good way of doing this. And I would imagine, moving forward, the Orc Javelins are going to fit into this mould. There aren't very many of them per unit, so they are going to be quite susceptible to being focused down, so you do need to be careful with them. You know, they are cheap, but you don't necessarily want to just throw them away without them accomplishing anything. But yeah, I mean, you know, there's not much to say about low-tier Javelins, really. They do what they do. And it's nice to see another variant of this. You know, they could have just slapped the Snaga Javelins into Mordor, but they took the time to add a new unit model. And I like that, because I think that the Orc Javelins, they suit Mordor's style a little bit more with those sort of natty wooden shields and the sort of javelin rack that they carry around on their backs. So yeah, that's it for Mordor, and we'll move on to, I think, Isengard next. Isengard only have one new unit in the upcoming batch, and it is the dreaded unlocalized placement text. But yeah, obviously the name has not been added yet, but the idea behind these guys, I think, is to be sort of Lurtz and his archers, so they're going to be an elite archer unit, although I would imagine that the focus is going to be more around them being a hybrid unit between archers and infantry, so I imagine they're going to be quite savage in a melee fight as well, and that's going to be the primary difference between them and presumably some of the other sort of elite archers, particularly from the human factions in particular. But yeah, it's an interesting concept for a unit, because Isengard have always had, their crossbows have always been very potent, but their archers have always been garbage. So the fact that they've got one unit now, which is potentially going to be able to do a decent job at range, is going to be interesting, because they could potentially be hidden off in the corner of the map somewhere. The enemy's not going to be paying much attention to them, and then they could win you the battle. It's going to be a sort of similar to a lot of other sort of high-tier archers. The longer you keep them alive and unnoticed in a battle, the more effective they're going to be. But if they get focused down early, there aren't really enough of them to withstand casualties for too long. So yeah, it'll be interesting to see how these guys perform. They look cool, of course. A lot of Isengard's higher-tier stuff has always looked quite menacing. But yeah, that is the new unit that you can look forward to using as Isengard. And just the fact that obviously crossbows are going to take a pretty substantial nerf means that having an arch unit like this could become a little bit more important for Isengard, particularly in an open field battle. So yeah, we'll see how they perform when the patch drops. Now this is a unit I was not sure whether to include or not, because I think that this is a unit which kind of comes under the same tier as like the Oathbreakers and sort of the units which are used for sort of certain things, because this is the Drake Broodlings, and I'm not sure whether they will actually be in the Orcs of the Misty Mountains. If they are, then they are the only new Misty Mountains unit, but I'm kind of convinced that they're not going to be. I mean, you can see these floating torches from the invisible Cav Riders. But yeah, I mean, this is something I think that was taken from the Middle-earth Shadow of games from WB. So I'm not sure whether you're going to see these guys or not. You might, but they will be sort of, I think, similar to the Oathbreakers. So if people are sort of starting to worry that these guys are not lore-friendly, which I can understand why, you shouldn't worry too much because I don't think these guys are going to be in the actual Misty Mountains roster. They might be, but I'm not sure. So we'll see. But other than that, the Misty Mountains, they do have the troll drummers just like Mordor, but other than that, they're going to be the same faction, other than the fact that the Blackwatch Legion have been moved. But yeah, that's really the only thing to talk about with the Orcs of the Misty Mountains. Kind of a strange one, but we'll see. This is kind of a more experimental unit, I think. So, Gundabad, a faction which is going to not be quite as ridiculously powerful as it was in the previous patch, but they still do have some new stuff. And the Barrow Wights are something which have been in the game in the past, but they were removed before, so they were in a patch that was quite a long time ago now. But I believe that the focus of these guys is to basically be the ultimate tar pit. They're not going to get a lot of killing done, I don't think, but they are going to hold up the enemy army for a huge amount of time because they're not going to be easy to cut through. And that's pretty much what to expect from these guys. They are at the lower end of the spectrum in terms of units. You know, they are in the same part of the list as stuff like the Goblins and the sort of low-tier Orcs of Gundabad. So, yeah, I mean, the Barrow Wights, it'll be interesting to see if this time they work, because previously they were they didn't really work because of the mechanics. So I'm curious to see if with the new patch and with the changes to how the game is meant to work, if the Barrow Wights will find their niche and find their place in Gundabad's army. But they aren't the only new Gundabad unit. I think they have one more as well, which is an altogether more damage dealing unit. These are pretty scary looking dudes, aren't they? The Troll Swords. So, you know, they're the only trolls, I believe, that have genuine shields. I mean, technically the snow trolls do, but like they're tiny and barely even worth taking into battle. Like, trolls are not going to parry with bucklers. These guys, however, I recognise that shield model. It's the Orcish shield model from Skyrim. And yeah, these guys, I think, are the best trolls that Gundabad can field. They might even be the strongest trolls in the game now, simply because they, obviously you can see the fact that they're wearing heavy armour, just like the Olag High. They've got large shields. The fact that they're wielding swords as well, I think they've got higher attack stats than the Trolls of Gundabad, certainly, but I'm not sure how they compare next to the Olag High and the Trolls of the White Hand, who previously were definitely the top two trolls. They were very close together in terms of quality. We'll see how the Troll Swords work. I mean, Gundabad are still intended to be a very aggressive faction. They've got very little in terms of ranged options. They don't even have the Númenórean Shadow Guard anymore, so I think the Goblin Trackers are literally the best ranged option for Gundabad. So if you're playing Gundabad, you can still expect them to come at you and try and destroy you, but you're going to be much more able to deal with that now because there aren't going to be quite so many hit points, and it's not going to be quite so easy for the Gundabad players to come forth and crush you underfoot. There's going to be a lot more skill involved, I think. But the Troll Swords are an interesting thing, because I wonder if these guys will actually be able to stand up to more elite units in melee for longer, because that seems to be where most trolls in Reforged fall down next to Vanilla. In Vanilla they were real powerhouses. In Reforged they're very much focused around being the initial shock value, and then you have to quickly reinforce them, otherwise it'll be a complete waste. I'll be interested to see if the Troll Swords kind of alleviate that a little bit, simply because of how tough they look. But yeah, that's Gundabad's new units, but we shall now move on. So Harad have got what I would call 1.5 new units, and this is the one new unit that they have, the Skull Crashers of Harad. I'm not sure whether that's supposed to be Skull Crushers, but interestingly enough, they are similar to the Trollmen, only more attack focused and more elite. The Trollmen are no longer going to be quite the tour de forces that they were in the last patch. Like, the Trollmen really were very, very effective elite infantry. Now they have been dialed back a little bit. Hopefully not, well, I mean, it's not going to be to the point in Vanilla where the Trollmen were kind of rubbish, but you know, a bit more of a balance is going to be found where the Trollmen are going to be elite damage dealing, but not quite able to take on all comers. The Skull Crashers, however, should be able to do this because they are going to be more elite. You're only going to be able to have one, I think, before the cost increases. Very scary looking, potentially going to be able to do a lot of damage in melee, but of course, as with most things Harad, you know, you're going to need to be careful, because Harad as an army are not going to last quite so long in an atrocious fight, simply because they don't have armour. They go into battle without their shirts on. So yeah, you got to love that about Harad. But now we'll move on to the other kind of new unit that Harad have. So again, I said that these guys are kind of new because they are essentially the replacement of what was the Serpent Bodyguard. They are the Black Serpent Bodyguards, and again, I felt like I needed to show these guys because the unit model looks so fantastic. And again, it is going to be sort of... Harald's cavalry has always been based a little bit more around speed and hit and run. That isn't going to change, but the Black Serpent bodyguards in particular are going to be much more able to sort of deal with some of the other shock cavalry from other factions. Again, cavalry has changed in the way it works, so it's going to take a little bit more explanation than just me saying these guys are good here. But yeah, the Black Serpent bodyguards are clearly going to be something that you're going to want to keep an eye on in the battle, otherwise they will be able to do a lot of damage off the charge. They are going to be very fast as well. And yeah, again, it's a similar sort of situation with the Cardinal Footmen, where I've showed these guys because they have changed a little bit in terms of how they function, I guess. But yeah, here are the Black Serpent bodyguards. Now we'll move on to the next faction. So, Umbar don't have any all-new units, but they do have the mounted and dismounted Númenórean Shield Guard added, which I do think is worth mentioning, because it is something which will add quite a lot to Umbar if what I think about Spearmen is going to come true in the current patch, where they are actually a genuinely useful unit and tool for dealing with enemy cavalry and of course for holding front lines, because Umbar have always had quite a strong infantry corps, but they've never been able to use it in the current patch, simply because arrows and cavalry would always destroy it, and that's a bit of a shame because I always liked Umbar's style. With the new mechanics, maybe the Númenórean Shield Guard can help alleviate that, and in particular the mounted Númenórean Shield Guard will be excellent if you want to go for a cavalry focused Umbar, which in the past you haven't been able to do because the Warlords as an individual unit were very, very strong of course, but you had to back them up with merchants, which would be destroyed by the cavalry forces of most of the other kingdoms of men. So yeah, it'll be interesting to see how these guys fit into Umbar as a whole. Not all new units, but again, still worth a little mention. Khand, however, have been given a couple of new units, and that one of which is the Narada Halberts. Now these guys, again, going to give Khand a pretty interesting option for their front line, because if you combine these guys particularly with the Footmen, you know, the similar unit model, their War Club and Tower Shield wielding brethren, you're going to have a very solid infantry front line. Now obviously that is going to come at a cost, you know, it is slightly more expensive than your lower tier, and that might take away from your cavalry presence, which as Khand might not be something you want to do. But even so, it's an interesting option which Khand have, and I do think that in terms of infantry they do have a genuine presence, which is interesting considering what kind of faction they are. They will still struggle in some situations, particularly against factions which are more skill based, like the Elves. Stuff, a lot of their armor piercing, which is a lot of what their infantry is based around, will not help them at all there. So again, I am interested to see how these Narada Halberts add to Khand's infantry line. The other Khand new unit, however, is not an infantry unit, it is a cavalry unit, so similar to Rohan. They've been given more infantry, but they've also been given more of what makes them strong, which is their cavalry. So let's go and have a look at that unit as well. And so we have the Chieftains Court, and, well, Chieftains, that's not spelt right, but the Chieftains Court, and obviously these guys look very menacing, and they are of course horse archers, which is another horse archer sort of option which Khand have been afforded, which means in terms of variety they have the most horse archers in the game, which if they've been buffed appropriately means that it will become Khand's new focus, I think. You know, that sort of very mobile, very sort of chip damage approach from their cavalry, maybe a few charges from their melee cavalry, and having a sort of solid infantry corps to hold back the rest. It could make for some interesting players. Khand, obviously there are only 25 in this unit, which does mean that it can be quite vulnerable, but ultimately I would view this as quite similar in many ways to the Red Shields previously, although the Red Shields are much more designed to be able to go into melee as well, whereas as the Chieftains Court, going into melee is something you really only want to do when you're out of ammunition, or if you want to really make sure of a melee cavalry fight that you're going to win it, because obviously as a general's bodyguard unit, which this is, they are going to be quite handy in terms of their stats. It's just going to be the amount in the unit which is going to let them down if you charge them into a huge cavalry blob all on their lonesome. But they look very cool, doubtless, and individually at least they have better stats than even the Brotherhood of the Bow. The Brotherhood units have been given a makeover as well, which I won't show here. I will wait until the Khandish faction overview, or maybe slightly before then, I don't know. But yeah, very cool looking new unit, and we'll see how effective horse archers can really be with some of the new additions in the upcoming patch. So I think Dol Amroth are a bit of a favourite of quite a lot of people because of their style, because of the, you know, the look of Dol Amroth, and the way they play is also quite pleasing as well. they only have one new unit in the upcoming patch, and that is these guys, the Dol Amroth Light Cavalry. And ironically, it was actually a militia tier cavalry that Dol Amroth were lacking, because they do have a huge variety of cavalry, yet none of it was sort of low tier or throwaway. And low tier cavalry like this is going to be a little bit more important, I think, in the upcoming patch with how cavalry is going to be intended to work. So this unit is going to add quite a lot to Dol Amroth, because as far as cavalry focused factions go, Dol Amroth isn't that far behind Rohan and Khand in terms of the in terms of the melee presence in terms of cavalry they can actually field. They don't have anything in terms of ranged, I don't think, but even so, it's going to be interesting to see how Dol Amroth deal with this, obviously with the sort of Norman-style teardrop shields. I think that this is a good addition to Dol Amroth, and while it may not be as exotic as some of the really high-tier stuff like the Chieftains Court we just looked at, it is going to be mechanically quite important for Dol Amroth, I think, to be able to field lower-tier cavalry like this, and they are, of course, just mounted Dol Amroth Spear Militia. So yeah, that is Dol Amroth's new addition, and we shall now move on. Now, this is an interesting one because I don't remember these guys being in the last patch, but I also feel as though they've simply replaced a similar unit. So here we have the Hir-i Duath. They certainly have a new name if they were existing in the previous patch. I think they've replaced the Woodland Sentinels, so I decided to show them anyway. You can see that some of them have got like burns on their face, which is interesting for elves. But yes, the Elves of Mirkwood have got one new addition at least. You know, this is the only new addition, and they are essentially a more ambush-focused archer. They are likely, they're not even armoured at all, really. But yes, obviously, sort of a slightly more ranger-focused archer, so speed. The Woodland Realms in general are the other faction alongside Gundabad, which are not going to be, you're not going to be able to just destroy everyone you come across when you play as them anymore. Particularly with the Woodland Realms, I think you're going to need to put in a lot more thought into how you're going to do it, because obviously your skirmish line is still exceptionally powerful and you're still going to need to use that to your advantage, but you're going to need to be a lot more savvy with how you sort of set up your line and how you want to engage the enemy. You're not going to just be able to take them head on anymore, again, in particular against factions which are more armoured and focused around numbers. So yeah, this is the Elves of Mirkwood. Now though, we shall move on to the three new factions where we're going to be spending a little bit more time, because some of the units that are in there did already exist, but a lot of them are quite new, so we'll go through them. Now, Rhudaur, they have taken a lot of units, obviously, from Gundabad. They've also taken some units from Cardolan, and also from another source, I believe. I think they've taken the Hillmen. Actually, no, they were Gundabad as well, weren't they? But yeah, Rhudaur do have some existing units, but they also have a lot of new ones, one of which are the Rhudaur Pikemen. Now, of course, the heavy pikes are the more elite variant of these guys. Rhudaur Pikemen are, of course, very low-tier pikes, so you know, they are basically the definition of low-tier pikes. They're just dudes that have been given a long, pointy stick. But these guys were in Moss, and low-tier pikes can be used to great effect. I mean, obviously they're going to be very vulnerable to archers, but if they can get into melee, they can punch above their weight, and they can at least hold back enemy infantry, and that's basically what cheap pikes are for. So it is going to be interesting to see how Rhudaur could maybe go for a pike-focused build instead of being really aggressive, which I think is the go-to strategy when you play as Rhudaur, would just be really, really on the front foot and try and destroy the enemy as quickly as possible. Whereas pikes necessitate a slightly more careful approach. But yeah, this is the first of the new Rhudaur units. So as you can see, we're going through the more basic units which make up Rhudaur's core first of all. So we've gone through the cheap pikes, and now we have the basic Rhudaur spearmen. Now obviously they have rather large shields and simple spears, so they are, you know, a basic spear unit is what you can expect from these guys. And it is going to be important as Rhudaur to have these more sort of solid, survivable units, which are just sort of designed to sort of keep your army together, because otherwise you could end up falling apart relatively quickly if you go for all offensive based units, because of course Rhudaur, not the most heavily armoured faction in the world. They are, of the three factions which make up the Realm of Arnor, the most lightly armoured. But yeah, it is, yeah, Rhudaur spearmen, basic spears. Hopefully in the new patch the spears will be a lot more useful, in which case you'll probably be seeing a lot of these guys in Rhudaur armies in general. And so, completing the trinity of Rhudaur's sort of basic bread and butter units, we have the Rhudaur Swordsmen. Of course, I think these guys have existed at some point in the game before as well. They've been given a makeover since then. They look much nicer now, and they were also, a unit similar to this was also present in Moss as well. You know, a basic swordsman is, you know, it is what it is. It's going to be able to hold the line. It's not going to be quite as effective as some of the more armoured units, but then Rhudaur in general also have more men in the unit. So again, it's more of a sort of orc philosophy that they follow, if you will. You know, they're going to be sort of individually, they may not be as skilled, but there are more of them. And the Rhudaur swordsmen, they provide another anchor to your line as well, which is more focused around holding back infantry as opposed to the spears, which are going to be more for zoning out cavalry and for sort of holding back large mass pushes as well. So yeah, the Rhudaur swordsmen with their hexagonal shields are going to be sort of one of the main sights you're going to see as Rhudaur. Obviously the Rhudaur savages, which have been given a new name, are also going to be the other one, but they already existed and they are largely unchanged. So now we shall move on to some of the more deadly Rhudaur foot-based units. So as I'm sure you can tell from the lower unit model count in this unit, this is one of Rhudaur's most elite units, the Angmar Enslavers. They are a halberdier unit as well, so they are going to be more focused around, well, they can be more focused around defensive abilities, but obviously you can throw them into the middle of a line that you're trying to push through and they will also do a very good job there. So they're obviously going to be very good at going through armour, they're going to be very good at holding a line, they're going to be very good at sort of, you're not really going to want to go too near to these guys unless you're sure you can just destroy them with overwhelming force. As with most elite units, there's not very many men in the unit, so you do want to be careful there. Obviously they do look rather intimidating, quite edgy as well, with the name and with the looks. So yeah, this is going to be Rhudaur's most elite sort of focused infantry unit, because, you know, Rhudaur do have quite a lot of units which are hybrids between javelins and melee units. This is going to be the most powerful pure melee unit that Rhudaur have available to them. But Rhudaur are kind of an interesting faction, they do have quite a lot of options. So let's go and see some of their other new units. So first of all, while sort of long-ranged archers may not be Rhudaur's focus, they do still have a presence on the field, and it is better, at least, than Gundabad's. First of all, we have the Dunman Hunters, and these guys are, of course, the lowest tier of Rhudaur's archers. They are focused more around the volume of arrow fire, they can get downrange quickly. And essentially, I believe their old name was the Fel Marksman, so it kind of gives you the idea of what kind of unit they are. Low tier, cheap archers to field, obviously, and just putting some pressure on the enemy's lines in a ranged capacity does make sense a lot of the time. So if you are a bit strapped for cash, you want to focus a little bit more in other areas, this might be the archer unit for you to use as Rhudaur. They do have other archers as well, which we will get onto right now. So now we have the Cold Fel Marksman, and of course these guys are just the upgraded, well, not upgraded variant, but the higher tier version of the previous archer unit. And of course these guys, they have chainmail, they've got slightly thicker furs, again more missile damage, slightly better in melee. This is what the Cold Fel Marksman will offer you for a little bit more money. And other than that, there's not really any difference in terms of what each unit offers you. They even have very similar unit models really, it's just that the Cold Fel Marksman are sort of slightly more well armoured, more well equipped for warfare as it were. But yeah, the Cold Fel Marksman, a slightly stronger archer unit than the Dunman before them. However, the most elite archer unit that Rhudaur are going to be able to field are these guys, the Hay Rendane Rangers. I hope that I've pronounced that right, but I probably haven't. Obviously, this is essentially Rhudaur's answer to the Dunedain Ranger, and, you know, it's pretty much going to do exactly the same thing. Rangers in the current patch again I think they've been changed up a little bit again. That's something that I'll go into a little bit more detail when the time comes. But for here, just know that this is going to be your best bow unit as Rhudaur, and they are pretty darn good. There are only 76 in the unit though, so they can be focused down by more archer-centric factions, but they are still a very valid unit to use against factions which you think you can go toe-to-toe with in terms of archer capability. In particular, against the Orc factions, these guys could potentially be very, very useful for thinning out the herd a little bit, in addition to some of the other lower tier Rhudaur archers that you have. It's another way to try and play Rhudaur. Again, your army pick is going to be quite important. So yeah, a pretty cool looking unit as well. I quite like the look. I've always liked Rhudaur's sort of more, sort of, you know, the brown sort of armour that they have, and this is a unit which sort of embraces that, and also the sort of the ranger aesthetic goes quite well with it, I think. But now we'll move on to, I think, what Rhudaur's focus is all about. So Rhudaur probably share more in common with the Easterlings and the Southrons than they do with their most immediate brethren, mainly because their main focus seems to be with hand-thrown projectiles, be that axes or javelins. Obviously these guys are the troll short axe throwers. Axe throwers have always had a slightly more forgiving arc of fire, so it's much more easier to throw these projectiles over the heads of a line. So in particular, if you were in a defensive siege and you had a pike line, if you put these guys in behind, they're going to be able to get a lot of damage done. And obviously they aren't quite as expensive as sort of the equivalent dwarven axe throwers and etc. I think that they might actually be the only axe thrower unit outside of the dwarves, although I might be wrong about that. But it is a bit of a boon for Rhudaur to have that if so. Obviously potentially very high damage, but they are also potentially very easily focused down, because obviously if you look at them, they're not going to be able to withstand quite the same level of skirmish fire as their dwarven equivalents. So yeah, that is the troll short axe throwers, but we're not done yet with Rhudaur's new hand-thrown projectile units, not by a long shot. So again, the Heyrendane Troll Hunters. It's all in the name. These guys, when you see a high-profile target, throw your javelins with these guys at it and they will drop pretty darn quickly. Obviously in terms of unit animation and look, they are quite similar to the Rohan unit equivalent, which was the... I can't quite remember the name of it, unfortunately. It's something like the Medusa Rain Guard or something like that, isn't it? I feel very, very foolish. But even so, the Heyrendane Troll Hunters are going to be a very similar unit to that, only they have more men in the unit, so they're going to be able to lay down a lot more punishment downrange more quickly. And also it means that they're going to be... I think these guys could well be a very big part of how Rhudaur operate on the field, simply because they can be used to take out high-profile cavalry, they can be used to take out high-profile infantry, and when they're done, they're a pretty effective infantry unit themselves to really help hammer home that advantage that they have helped to create. So yeah, it's going to be similar. Also, it's worth saying as well that the Dunedain Troll Slayers are now no longer an archer unit, but I think they're going to be very similar to the Rhudaur and Rohan units of the same type, so they are now javelins as well. So yeah, very neat looking unit as well. I do like Rhudaur's basic style. So here we have the Furrowed Rim Javelins, and these guys are again another javelin unit. The difference being that these guys are more vulnerable, you know, they have lower defense stats, but in melee they are much more attack focused. You can see those nasty looking spiked clubs they carry. They are, whereas the Troll Hunters are more armoured and designed to take a little bit more of a beating and sort of go after more elite units, these guys are sort of a javelin shock infantry hybrid, it would seem. At least that's the sense I'm getting from them. I believe in the past they have been called the Rhudaur Slaughterers as well. Where they also differ slightly is the fact that these guys will have 2 HP, whereas the Troll Hunters will not have an extra hit point. So that's going to be where they get their survivability from, to allow them to get into melee and really start laying a hurting down. And Rhudaur in general are going to be very effective against armoured factions, and this is kind of the ultimate form of that. Javelins, going to be very good at that, and then they pull out their spiked great clubs and doing a lot more AP damage with them. So yeah, the Furrowed Rim Javelins are another unit in the vein of Rhudaur's overall focus, perhaps the ultimate sort of representation of that focus. And last, but by no means least in terms of all new Rhudaur units, there are obviously more units that Rhudaur have, but mostly they are sort of changed up versions of units that already existed and have been moved from other factions to them. We have the Heyrendane Nobles, and these guys are the most elite of the Rhudaur cavalry. In terms of cavalry, Rhudaur are not intended to sort of go head to head with a lot of others, but these guys are capable of doing that individually. Provided they aren't swamped by sort of loads of other elite heavy cavalry from other factions, they will be able to hold their own against a lot of other units. They are very similar in many ways to the Black Serpent Guard of Harad we showed earlier in terms of what they're all about. There are only 25 of them, and that does denote that they are very elite individually. So it is going to be interesting to see how Rhudaur use these guys, because obviously they are quite prone to being outnumbered, because for the most part you have your Rhudaur Maidens, which are now a mounted unit, and that is the difference there, and the Rhudaur Scouts. Both of those are not exactly super elite, but if you get enough of them and saturate your nobles with them, perhaps Rhudaur could be a cavalry force against the right factions, and I think that's going to be the interesting thing with Rhudaur moving forward. You're going to need to pick your army correctly, more so with them than a lot of other factions, because you have a lot of options to use. It's about picking the right one, the right tools for the job. Obviously against Rohan, you're not going to want to try and go toe-to-toe with them in terms of cavalry, but in terms of infantry, your infantry is going to be better. and it's going to be interesting to see how all of this plays out. But yeah, definitely another very nice looking unit for Rhudaur. But now we shall move on to the new Elven offering in the shape of Linden. Now with Linden, technically speaking, all of the units are new, but a lot of them are very, very similar to units that we see from the other Elven factions, which is why I'm going to focus more on the new Linden units, which sort of identify them as their own faction. So for example, Linden have got the same sort of high tier swordsman, and they've got the sort of the Quindi, which were from Imladris initially. They've got the sort of pikemen, which are essentially the Linden long spears but changed up. However, these guys, the Noldorin Blade Masters, are very elite two-hander sword units, and where most Elven factions have got Eldarenway swordsmen, Sylvan heavy swordsmen, you know, and then you've got the Hirti Lang from the Woodland Realms, Linden have that equivalent, but they also have these guys, which are essentially one step above, and that should sort of start to explain where Linden's focus is going to come in. Obviously, they're going to be very skilled, very high damage potentially, but they are also going to be a little bit more vulnerable in some ways, I think, Linden. It's going to be, obviously, a lot of this I'm going to save for the faction overviews, but, you know, this is a potentially extremely deadly unit if you can get it into melee. They're going to be very difficult to take down, particularly for units that don't have a lot of skill. Again, Noldorin Blade Masters, going to be very, very tough. Not AP, but still going to be able to do a lot of damage. So the other focus of Linden, I would say, is where most elves tend to prioritise maximum range. Linden, on the other hand, in a similar vein to Rhudaur, ironically, have a bit more of a focus around hand-thrown projectiles. Javelins, obviously, you know, more so. There aren't any axe throwers in Linden. But they have 2 units of foot-based javelins, of which this is the slightly more elite variant, the Mithlond Marines. And this is going to mean that you're going to have a lot of close-range punch as Linden, and it means that you're going to be able to really thin the enemy ranks a little bit before you get into melee, and then the enemy are going to struggle even more against your very highly skilled Linden foot soldiers. So it is going to be interesting to see how Linden perform. I think that, honestly, of all of the Elven factions with the focuses, Linden might be the most difficult to play, simply because if you get it wrong, your army's going to fall apart pretty quickly, based on its vulnerabilities. But kind of a high-risk, high-reward situation, I think, with Linden. At least I think that's what it's going to be like. Again, I could be wrong, and Linden might be the easiest of the Elven factions to play. But you are going to need to know what you're doing with regards to your javelin positioning and all of that sort of thing to really get the most out of this faction, because if you don't, you might end up taking quite a lot of losses quite quickly. That's not to say, however, that Linden don't have a good archer presence, because obviously they do, like most Elven units. Well, Elven factions. In particular, though, the one that stands out the most to me are these guys, the Wardens of Lothlorien, because they are essentially an ambush-focused archer, which I think Linden, if you play them right, they could turn out to be a very strong ambush-focused faction, which has worked in the past, both for and against me. So the prospect of trying to get good with Linden, as it were, could be an interesting one, because this is a unit which can potentially do a lot of damage. Obviously, elves, you know, range, accuracy, they're always going to be the tops in these things. In a skirmish fight, they may well struggle a little bit, simply because it's obvious they don't have the most armour, but I do think they qualify as a ranger unit, which does mean that they come into a bunch of other mechanics which are potentially present. So yeah, obviously this is the most, I think this is the most elite archer in terms of damage as well that Linden have, so potentially very high damage. Again, high risk, high reward, it would seem. So of course, the Dane Nobles, the chariots of Linden. This is again kind of an unknown variable until I actually sort of play and sort of use them properly, because of course chariots have been pretty miss most of the time in Medieval 2's mechanics. Runes still have their chariots as well, but maybe with the new rebalancing, chariots can be good. The primary difference between the runic and the Linden chariots is that the runic ones, I believe, fire arrows, which means they can fire from longer range but less damage. The Linden ones, as appropriate for their faction, throw javelins, which means potentially, if chariots work, these guys could be pretty damn scary. They could punch through lines and they could do a lot of damage, but obviously if they get stuck, generally they tend to die pretty quickly, and they aren't exactly what you would call cheap. Not easy to use, I would imagine. Just, you know, chariots tend to perform kind of strangely in Medieval 2's mechanics, but we'll see if the new patch sort of makes it so that chariots are a little bit more user-friendly. we'll see, but they are still one of the new things in Linden which you can't help but point out. So the final unit that I'm going to show as Linden kind of typifies what I think their cavalry game is going to be all about, because while they do have the Noldorin Horse Lords, which are essentially the mounted variant of the two-handed sword unit I showed earlier, which is the elite one, this is a Horse Archer Shock Cavalry variant, which is kind of the opposite thinking to the Red Shields of Rohan. The Red Shields of Rohan are meant to do a lot of damage, and then they're meant to go into melee in a mounted sense. These guys, however, are meant to then, as soon as they're out of ammunition, they're supposed to pull out their lances and charge down infantry units. They're not going to be particularly good against other cavalry, because that's not what shock cavalry is going to be about in the new patch. So you're going to have to really sort of know what each individual unit of cavalry is good and bad at. So these guys are going to be good at softening up the enemy and then getting some nice charges off to really hammer home that advantage, doing a lot of damage and then allowing your infantry to sort of clean up the mess, as it were. And I think that's what Linden are going to be good at, because they do have their Linden Scouts, which are their lower tier cavalry. They have their Linden Lancers, which are kind of the sort of mid tier, and then the Horse Lords, which are the tougher variant, obviously. But they're still going to be more vulnerable than most. Obviously, Linden, not very focused around their armour, so you are going to have to be careful. But that's just part of the challenge when playing as them, I think. So yeah, the Wardens of Harlingen are the other unit that I would sort of point out as being completely new, because they are a hybrid cavalry, which the concept of which is going to be more relevant in the current patch more than ever. But now we shall move on to the Dwarves of Qasr, who have some new units, and some, of course, have been taken from the Dwarven roster of old, particularly the Khazad units, which obviously I won't be showing, but we'll see some of the new sort of Dwarves of Qasr Legion units. And the first new unit from the mines of Moria, as it were, are the 1st Legion Infantry. And looking at the rosters, I think the idea is for Erebor to be the sort of more well-rounded army. So the Ironfoot have always been really good at forming a core to your army. That's going to be Erebor's thing. Qasr, I think the idea is to have a smaller army but more elite. So you're going to be elite focused, kind of like the Imladris of the Dwarven world, essentially. The 1st Legion Infantry are kind of that philosophy. You do have the Khazad Infantry available to you, which is kind of the equivalent to the Ironfoot, but you also have these guys. These guys are slightly more expensive, slightly fewer in the unit, but individually they are going to be tougher to break down, very difficult to sort of smash your way through, of course, and that I think is going to be Qasr strength. In sieges, that's going to stand them in good stead. In field battles, they're going to be a little bit more challenging to play with than Erebor, but not impossible, simply because of how the mechanics are going to work, I think, in the new patch. But they certainly look cool. Obviously that sort of really nice scale mail armour. But now we'll move on to some other new additions to Qasr. So we have another 1st Legion unit, and this time it's the 1st Legion Pikes. And again, the philosophy is largely the same here, I think, where you have the Ironfoot Pikes from Erebor. There are more of them, but these guys are more elite. So that's kind of the trade-off that you're going to be going with, I think, a lot of the time when you play as Qasr. And yeah, I mean, these guys look good. Their weaponry as well, like the pikes they use, look really cool. And again, a lot of the Qasr new stuff, I think, is based like on these 1st Legion units, because it does give Qasr their core, which obviously when you're building a new faction you do need, as we've seen with Rhudaur and Linden. So yeah, obviously these pikemen are going to be very difficult to force your way through dwarves at the best of times. Even worse when you have to try and force your way through dwarven heavy pikemen. So we've had sort of the heavy infantry, we've had the pikes, and now it follows, of course, that we have the spearmen. We have the 1st Legion shield guards. As if the dwarves needed more mass, the spearmen have always been slightly better at doing that. And obviously, you know what to expect from dwarven spearmen. They're going to be very, very tough to break down, heavily armoured, heavily shielded. Going through them from the front is going to be very tricky, simply because these guys are going to add that extra rigidity to the Qasr lines. And in a field battle in particular, I think these guys could turn out to be very, very important, simply because they're going to be one of the things that deals with the enemy cavalry. They do have the mounted crossbows, of course, in terms of the mercenary unit that the other dwarven faction and some of the other human factions have also. So that's going to be another thing. But in particular, if you're going to be taking Qasr onto an open field, like the grassy plain, which is going to be pretty challenging for you, I think, these guys could well turn out to be your saving grace against enemy heavy cavalry. But yeah, the 1st Legion, I think, make up the entirety of Qasr new units, but we're not done quite yet. with what they have to offer. So let's move on to the final 2 units I have to show you today. And so here we have the 1st Legion's answer to the Axemen of Erebor, the 1st Legion X-Guard, and obviously, again, Dwarven shock troops, going to be very effective at sort of chopping their way through the enemy armoured units. Going to be, again, aggressive focused Dwarven units. You need to choose when to use them wisely, otherwise they can burn out a little quickly. But again, you know, the 1st Legion, they've got this sort of uniform style. One thing that I have noticed, which I do quite like, if we just go around here, please ignore the Yoreling militia that are sort of standing in the background. I like the fact that each sort of 1st Legion unit has got their own symbols on the back. It gives the sort of sense that this is sort of their division, and the sense that that's the unit they belong to. It's kind of cool, and I do like that. And I do like the style of the 1st Legion Axe-Guard overall. I've always been a big fan of shock units that carry 2-hander axes. But now we'll move on to the final unit I have to show you today, which is the best of the 1st Legion units. And here we have Khazad-dûm's answer to the Dwarven Noblemen, the 1st Legion Bodyguards. Of course, again, it's going to be equivalent units. I think that the idea is going to be the same. This is going to be sort of a General's Bodyguard inspired unit. Obviously, Khazad-dûm have the Mithril Guard and the Guards of Khazad-dûm. Erebor have got the Grim Guard, the Dragon Slayers of Ered Mithrin, and the other one. What's the other one? Well, oh yeah, the Sons of Durin, of course, the shock infantry version with the Warhammers. But yes, the 1st Legion Bodyguards going to be very tough to break down, obviously. And again, there's not really much to say about them other than the fact that they are intended to be a General's Bodyguard unit, so they're naturally going to be very, very good. And as Dwarves, you know what to expect from Dwarves. Very tough to kill, and, you know, very heavily armoured, very heavily shielded. The best of the 1st Legion units. But yeah, that is the final unit to show you today in terms of all new stuff. It is worth saying, of course, that Dale, Imladris, Rune, and Arthedain have no new units in them, at least no all new units, but they all of them, especially Dale, it has to be said, have got pretty drastic visual changes, and of course they will play very differently to how they have done in the past. So yeah, so that was a quick look at the new units that you can look forward to in 0.95. I'm very glad that the patch seems to be coming out soon, because some new life really needs to be injected in, and it's coming at just the right time, I think. Now, interestingly enough, I think what I'm going to do is, based on, I don't quite know when the new patch is coming out, to be fair, but I do think that the first thing I'm going to do when it does come out is do the faction overviews. And I think, in terms of the order in which I'm going to do that, I'm going to throw it over to you, I think. I think that what I'm going to do, I'll set up some kind of straw poll or some sort of, I'll just ask you to sort of put down in the comments what faction you think I'm going to do first. So if there is a straw poll in the description below, feel free to use that, and that will be what I'm using. If not, sort of let me know in the comments which faction you would like me to do an overview of first, and I'll sort of do it in the order that you deign to decide. Also, something else that I'm sort of eager to know is, what are you most excited about in the upcoming patch? Like, are you more excited about the mechanical changes? Are you more excited about one of the 3 new factions? Are you more excited about sort of the prospect of new units in existing factions which you really liked playing? Let me know, because I would be interested to know that. And yeah, I hope you enjoyed this, and I hope you will join me for whatever is next, and I'm really glad to be doing this sort of thing again.